Welcome to The Red Pill with your host, Steve Douglas. Here on The Red Pill, we'll be exploring things that others don't want you to know. Controversial topics that deal with truths hidden and ignored by the lamestream media. Be warned that if you listen with an open mind and research the material we cover for yourself, you may never look at the world quite the same again. To keep your comfort zone, take the blue pill and turn off this podcast now. To open your mind to painful reality, sit back, take the red pill, and continue listening as we endeavor to discover how deep the rabbit hole really goes.
Welcome to The Red Pill. I am your host, Steve Douglas, in the studio with my producer, Arthur Wynn.
Good evening.
In our premiere episode, we will be talking about the criminalization of marijuana, the real reasons why it was criminalized, the people who led the crusade to demonize it, their motivations, the damage that the greed of men long dead has caused the U.S. society and economy over the last 70-plus years, the financial and social benefits of legalizing marijuana and hemp, and what we feel would be the best way to handle that legalization to maximize those benefits. Let's start with why marijuana is illegal. Most folks assume that marijuana was criminalized through some sort of process that involved medical studies, scientific data, government hearings that determined that this was a dangerous drug to our citizens. The actual story is completely different. Those who voted on the fate of this plant never had the facts, but in fact were dependent on data supplied by people who had a specific agenda to deceive our legislators. You will see in this broadcast that the very first federal vote to prohibit marijuana was based entirely on documented lies told on the floor of the United States Senate. You will also see that the entire history of marijuana's criminalization is filled with fear, racism, yellow journalism, protection of corporate profits, personal career advancement and greed, and ignorant or incompetent and or corrupt leaders. These are the actual reasons that marijuana was criminalized. Now, Arthur's going to give us a little bit of a background on the history of marijuana leading up to the criminalization of marijuana in the United States of America.
Here is your timetable for marijuana/hemp. 7,000 to 8,000 BC, the first woven fabric believed to be made out of hemp. In 1619, in the colony of Jamestown, Virginia passes a law requiring farmers to grow hemp. In the 1700s, hemp was a primary grown crop by George Washington at Mount Vernon and a secondary crop grown by Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. 1884, Maine is the first state to outlaw alcohol. 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act is passed, forming the Food and Drug Administration. This is the first time that drugs have any government oversight. 1913, California. They apparently passed the first state marijuana law, though missed by many because it is referred to as preparations of hemp or loco weed. 1914, the Harrison Act is passed, outlawing opiates and cocaine, and ends up being basically a taxing scheme to generate tax revenue. In 1915, Utah passes the first state anti-marijuana law.
And that brings us to the Mexican connection. At about the same time that California was passing its marijuana laws and the Harrison Act was going through, and just before the 18th Amendment alcohol prohibition, in the early 1900s, many of the western states, specifically the southwestern states, developed significant tensions regarding the influx of Mexican Americans, not unlike what's taking place in the Southwest today. The revolution in Mexico in 1910 spilled over the border, and this caused the United States to send General Pershing along with the American Expeditionary Force into Mexico to clash with Pancho Villa. Later in that decade, bad feelings naturally developed between the small farmer and the large farms that used the cheap Mexican labor, just like what's happening today. Then along came the Depression, and these tensions were increased because jobs and welfare resources became more and more scarce. One of the differences that the people of this time seized upon in terms of the Mexican connection was the fact that Mexicans smoked marijuana and had brought the plant with them. It was through this that California apparently passed the first state law banning the use of the plant. However, one of the first states that did this, and may have been influenced not just by Mexicans using the drug, but oddly enough, because of Mormons smoking marijuana. That's right, Mormons. Mormons had traveled to Mexico in 1910, and they came back to Salt Lake City with marijuana. Of course, the Mormon Church obviously did not react favorably to this, and that probably contributed to the state's marijuana law. Other states quickly followed suit with similar prohibition laws. Wyoming in 1915, Texas in 1919, Iowa in 23, along with Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Arkansas, and Nebraska finally in 27. These laws tended to be specifically targeted against the Mexican-American population. In 27, when Montana passed their laws prohibiting the use of marijuana, a newspaper, the Butte, Montana Standard, reported a legislator's comment, quote, "When some beet field peon takes a few traces of this stuff, he thinks he has just been elected president of Mexico, so he can start out to execute all of his political enemies," unquote. Similar racial comments were made on the Senate floor of Texas. Quote, "All Mexicans are crazy, and this stuff, marijuana, is what makes them crazy," unquote. Now, that's the Mexican angle on the racism. There were also racial overtones towards blacks and Latin Americans in regard to the use of marijuana. This, however, was mostly in the eastern states. In these areas, the problem was attributed to a combination of Latin Americans and black jazz musicians. You see, marijuana and jazz traveled from New Orleans to Chicago and then to Harlem. This is where marijuana became an indispensable part of the music scene. It even entered the language of the black hits at the time. Louis Armstrong's Muggles, Cab Calloway's, that funny reefer man, Fats Weller, Viper Drag. Once again, racism was used as part of the argument for the criminalization of marijuana. As newspapers in 1934 editorialized, quote, "Marijuana influences Negroes to look at white people in the eye, step on men's shadows, and look at white women twice." Two other fear tactic rumors started to spread at the same time. One, that Mexicans, blacks, and other foreigners were snaring white children with marijuana, and two, the story of the assassins. You see, early stories of Marco Polo had told of hashish eaters, or hashins, from which derived the term assassin. In the original stories, these guys were professional killers and were given large doses of hashish and brought to the ruler's garden, giving them a glimpse of the paradise that awaited them upon the successful completion of their mission. And after the effects of these drugs disappeared, the assassin would fulfill his ruler's wish with cool, calculating loyalty. By the 1930s, this story had been altered. Dr. A.E. Fosser wrote in the 1931 New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal the following: "Under the influence of hashish, those fanatics would madly rush at their enemies and ruthlessly massacre everyone within their grasp." Now, that's a little bit different than smoking some hash and hanging out in a garden and then coming down and going out not under the influence of anything and willfully carrying out an assassination. But this is part of the propaganda that was put forth at that time. And we'll see here before long why this propaganda was put forth. Due to this type of propaganda, it was a very short time before marijuana started being linked to violent behavior. Now, alcohol prohibition and the federal approach to drug prohibition are very similar. During this time, the United States was also dealing with the prohibition of alcohol, which lasted from 1919 to 1933. The prohibition of alcohol was extremely visible, and it was a widely debated topic at all levels of society. While the drug laws were passed without the general public's knowledge, national alcohol prohibition happened through the mechanism of an amendment to the Constitution. Earlier, in 1914, the Harrison Act that Arthur told us about was passed. This provided federal tax penalties for opiates and cocaine. The federal approach is important because it was considered at the time that the federal government did not have the constitutional power to outlaw alcohol or drugs. It is because of this that alcohol prohibition required a constitutional amendment. At that time, our country's history, the judiciary regularly placed the 10th Amendment in the path of congressional regulation of local affairs. And the direct regulation of medical practice was considered beyond congressional power. For those of you who aren't familiar with the 10th Amendment, it simply states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And basically what this means is that if the Constitution doesn't say that it's the federal government's power, and it doesn't say that the states aren't allowed to do it, then that matter becomes something for the individual states and the people of those states to decide, and the federal government has no power over it. This is why it took a constitutional amendment in 1919 to prohibit the use of alcohol. So what we have to ask ourselves is why, a mere 20 years later, give or take, the 10th Amendment was no longer an obstacle to the federal government doing the same thing with marijuana and hemp. And we're going to discover how that occurred. As I've just stated, at that time, the judiciary regularly used the 10th Amendment to block Congress from regulating local affairs, and direct regulation of medical practice was considered beyond congressional power under the Commerce Clause. Since then, both provisions have been weakened, and to the point where they almost have no meaning. But that's a whole different story. Since drugs could not be outlawed at the federal level, the decision was made in 1914 with the Harrison Act to use federal taxes as a way around the restriction. In the Harrison Act, legal use of opiates and cocaine were taxed, supposedly as a revenue need by the federal government, which is the only way it would hold up in the courts. And those who didn't follow the law found themselves in trouble with the Treasury Department. This is key, the Treasury Department. In 1930, a new division in the Treasury Department was established, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The man who was named to head this was the nephew of the director of the Treasury. At the time, that was Andrew W. Mellon. He appointed his nephew, Harry J. Anslinger, as the director of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics. This marked the beginning of an all-out war against marijuana. Let's examine for a moment who Harry J. Anslinger was. He was an extremely ambitious man. He recognized the Bureau of Narcotics as an amazing career opportunity. This was a new government agency with the opportunity to define both the problem and the solution. He immediately realized that opiates and cocaine wouldn't be enough to help build this agency to the power base that he desired. So he sized into marijuana and used it as a vehicle to build that power base by working to make it